daily attacks where people march to the court, try to gain entrance, and set fires, thrown things, used explosives, and injured police, including just this past weekend, perhaps permanently blinding 3 federal officers with lasers. We are on the defense. We're not out looking for trouble. And if the state and the city would provide the law enforcement services that other jurisdictions do, we would have no need to have additional marshals in the courthouse.
On behalf of hundreds of millions of Americans, thank you for that clarification, and thank you for being here. And thank you for your service today and your willingness to do this in very challenging times. Mr. Attorney General, we're very appreciative. It's not an easy job. It's a vitally important one. I so appreciated what you said in your opening statement today, which is what you said in your confirmation hearing. The Attorney General has a unique obligation. He holds in trust the fair and impartial administration of justice. We appreciate that so much. The Democrats have asserted here this morning, and they continue to say in the media, that under your leadership, the Justice Department has become highly politicized. Why is that a totally unfounded allegation?
Because actually what I've been trying to do is restore the rule of law. And the rule of law is, at essence, that we have one rule for everybody. If you apply one rule to A, the same rule applies to B. And I felt we didn't have that previously at the department. We had strayed. And I would just ask people, I'm supposedly punishing the president's enemies and helping his friends. What enemies have I indicted? Who could you point to one indictment that has been under the department that you feel is unmerited, that you feel violates the rule of law? One indictment. Now, you say I helped the president's friends. The cases that are cited, the Stone case and the Flynn case, are both cases where I determined that some intervention was necessary to rectify the rule of law, to make sure people are treated the same. I said Stone was prosecuted under me, and I said all along I thought that was a righteous prosecution. I thought he should go to jail, and I thought the judge's sentence was correct. But the line prosecutors were trying to advocate for a sentence that was more than twice anyone else in a similar position had ever served. And this is a 67-year-old man, first-time offender, no violence, and they were trying to put him in jail for 7 to 9 years. And I wasn't going to advocate that, because that is not the rule of law. I agree the president's friends don't deserve special breaks, but they also don't deserve to be treated more harshly than other people. And sometimes that's a difficult decision to make, especially when you know you're going to be castigated for it. But that is what the rule of law is, and that's what fairness to the individual ultimately comes to, being willing to do what's fair to the individual.
Amen, and thank you for that. And by contrast, what the previous DOJ did under the previous administration was politicize law enforcement. The Obama-Biden administration sabotaged the Trump transition. They illegally spied on the Trump campaign. They unmasked members of the Trump campaign. They employed aggressive tactics on their campaign officials. Senior FBI officials, we all know on this committee, carried over from the Obama administration, carried on their abuses into the Trump administration and into the whole impeachment scam and all the rest. Let me ask you just one question because my time is running out. President Obama's Attorney General Eric Holder famously referred to himself as President Obama's wingman. He said in an interview, quote, "I'm still enjoying what I'm doing. There's still work to be done. I'm still the president's wingman, so I'm there with my boy." That's what he said famously. Is it the duty of the Attorney General to be the president's wingman?
No, I've already described what I think the duty of the Attorney General is.
And in your office, you are then free to act independently of the president. Isn't that true?
That is true, particularly on criminal cases. It's required.
And that's exactly what he has asked you to do. Isn't that right?
Yes.
I have no further time. I yield back. Thank you.
As well, you have no further questions. Your time has expired. Ms. Lofgren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Attorney General, it's obvious what is happening here from the video played during the ranking members' remarks. It's clear that the president's playbook is to divert attention from his catastrophic failure in dealing with the COVID-19 situation. In Canada, our neighbor to the north, in Europe, the virus has been reduced to such a level that people can safely go out and not worry about being infected. But here in the United States, millions of Americans have been infected. Tens of thousands are dying, and the president needs to divert from that failure. And what is the playbook? The playbook is to create the impression that there is violence, that he must send in federal troops, and that the American people should be afraid of other Americans and trust the president because he's going to send in all troops to American cities. And that's how he hopes to win the election. You know, it's one thing to fight crime with joint task forces. That involves the cooperation of state and local officials. But the governor of Oregon and the mayor of Portland has asked that the federal troops leave because the reaction has actually been in reverse proportion. People are showing up because the troops are there. And I'd like to say that so many of them, I would say most of them, are nonviolent. We've all heard about the wall of moms who show up to make sure that people are safe. And here's what they say. They say they've been tear gassed night after night, left vomiting, that they've been shot at with rubber bean bags, pepper spray. So this brutality has created even more demonstrators. I'd just like to ask you this. When the president issued his executive order, they indicated your department should prioritize investigations. Has your department started any investigations pursuant to the executive order that the president issued?
Which executive order, Congresswoman?
The executive order that asked for the deployment of troops to protect the monuments and the federal facilities.
Yes,
On June 26th.
yeah, I wouldn't say it was troops, but we have initiated investigations. Yes, we've made arrests of people who have been rioting and taken down statues. But I think your characterization of Portland is completely false.
I would like to, we can get into that, but I'd like to ask you a question about surveillance, if I may. We've heard reports that cell site stimulators known as stingrays or dirt boxes are being used to collect phone call location and even content of phone calls. Drones are being used that may have face recognition or cell phone interception technology, and that there is bulk collection of internet browsing history. What specific authority is the department using for these surveillance tools?
I really can't speak to those instances if they in fact occurred. I'm glad to go and try to determine what you're talking about.
Well, actually, I'm asking about authority, not the details.
Well, I think most of our cyber activities are conducted by the FBI under their law enforcement powers to detect and prevent crime, federal crime.
I think the American public should know that this surveillance technique isn't just about the people in front of the courthouse. If a husband and wife call each other and one of the spouses has a cell phone that's within range of one of these technologies, not only the location, but the actual content of that couple's conversation can be scooped up using this technology. So this really isn't just about the demonstrating. This is about the privacy of all Americans, and it's all being violated for the president's political purposes of trying to create a scene, create a reason, divert attention from the COVID failure. I think it's really very unfortunate and a disservice to the American people. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. So
Point of order.
Gentlelady yields back.
Mr. Chairman, point of order. Real quick.
Gentleman will state his point of order.
Could you ask those members who choose not to come to work to silence their cell phones on the video because it's distracting to what we're doing here today?
That is not a point of order. I now recognize Mr. Chabot.
Mr. Attorney General, would it be accurate to say that it's this administration's responsibility, and of course you're part of the administration, to see that federal laws are upheld and that the federal property is secure and safe and protected? Is that correct?
That's right, Congressman. There are sort of distinct missions. One mission is to enforce federal law. And by the way, the federal government is the sovereign of the United States. We have two sovereigns here in the United States, and we enforce the federal law all over the country. Every square foot of the country, we enforce federal law. The other is protecting federal property, and specifically U.S. courthouses, which are the heart of federal property in all 93 jurisdictions in the United States. And we have the obligation to protect federal courts, and the U.S. Marshals specifically have been given that obligation. Federal courts are under attack. Since when is it okay to try to burn down a federal court? If someone went down the street to the Prettyman Court here, that beautiful courthouse we have right at the bottom of the hill, and started breaking windows and firing industrial-grade fireworks in to start a fire, throw kerosene balloons in and start fires in the court, is that okay? Is that okay now? No, the U.S. Marshals have a duty to stop that and defend the courthouse, and that's what we are doing in Portland. We are at the courthouse defending the courthouse. We're not out looking for trouble.
Thank you, General. And as far as weapons and devices that were utilized by the group of people, and you mentioned trying to destroy the courthouse. I mean, they were literally trying to burn it down and apparently didn't give a hoot about the people that were occupied in the building as well. So people were in danger.
That is absolutely right.
So as far as the weapons that you mentioned, let me get this straight. My understanding is that the people attacking the building had, among other things, rifles, explosives, knives, saws, sledgehammers, tasers, slingshots, rocks, bricks, lasers. Have I missed anything, or does that about cover it?
You have missed some things, but that's a good list.
Well,
But, you know, they have these powerful slingshots with ball bearings that they shoot. They've used pellet guns. We believe we have found those projectiles have penetrated marshals to the bone. And they use the lasers to blind the marshals. They do start fires. They start fires if they can get the fire inside or through the windows, and they start fires along the outside of the courthouse. When the marshals come out to try to deal with the fire, they're assaulted.
General, if local elected officials, mayors and city councils and governors did their jobs and kept the peace, would it even be necessary for federal law enforcement personnel to be there in the first place?
No, and that's exactly the point. Look around the country. Even where there are these kinds of riots occurring, we haven't had to put in the kind of reinforcements that we have in Portland because the state and local law enforcement does their job and won't allow rioters to come and just physically assault the courthouse. In Portland, that's not the case.
General, some have derisively referred to these law enforcement personnel as stormtroopers and worse. Does that accurately describe them, or would you like to set the record straight?
No, they're obviously not stormtroopers. You know, normally we would have a group of deputy marshals in a court that would be, in business suits and ties or regular civilian dress. Those would be the deputy marshals as the protective force for the court. But after almost a month of rioting in Portland, we sent in, I think it was around the 4th of July timeframe, we sent in about 20 special operations marshals. And those are tactical teams that are able, are padded and protected so they could deal with this kind of thing. Up until last week, I was told we had our stormtrooper from the Department of Justice amounted to 29 marshals in the courthouse. 29 marshals. As of until recently increased, I think there were 95, I was told, 95 DHS and Federal Protective Service and other DHS officers trying to protect the courthouse and 3 other buildings. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to protect federal functions and federal buildings, which are a very small part of the city, but the rioters go at them, and we have gradually increased our numbers there to try to protect those facilities. If the state would come in and keep peace on the streets in front of the courthouse, we wouldn't need additional people at the courthouse.
Thank you, John. My time's expired.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Mr. Chairman, before I begin, I'd like to submit into the record a picture of Lewis and Clark History Department chair of shot at protests in Portland. Ask unanimous consent. Place that into the record. John Lewis in 1963 said, "We are tired about being beat by police. We're tired of being put in jail. We want our freedom now." Mr. Attorney General, in your remarks, you indicated that we made great progress since that time, and you indicated that the killing of George Floyd was shocking. I disagree. It was outright cold-blooded murder on the streets of America, unfortunately by police misconduct. You seem to have a difficult time understanding systemic racism and institutional racism that has plagued so many. Mr. Attorney General, do you understand a black mother's or parent's talk to their child, to their son? Do you know what that is?
I think I do.
I don't know if you do, but Trayvon Martin, Ahmaud Arbery, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Sean Bell, and George Floyd. Black mothers and fathers have had to talk to their sons about police violence. I take no backseat to the history of this committee that has stood for good policing, not misconduct. And so I ask you this question: does the Trump Justice Department seek to end systemic racism and racism in law enforcement? I just need a yes or no answer.
To the extent there is racism in any of our institutions in this country and the police, then obviously this administration will fully enforce this.
So you agree that there may be systemic racism?
To the extent, in where?
Let me continue my line of questioning.
I don't agree that there's systemic racism in the police department.
Specifically,
generally in this country.
I'm reclaiming my time, Mr. General. Specifically, do you understand the violent impact of racial profiling? And do you support the end racial profiling, racial and religious profiling in the George Floyd bill, including the removal of the strict interpretation of qualified immunity, which would leave individuals like Breonna Taylor and George Floyd without any relief at all?
No, I'm opposed to eliminating qualified immunity, and I don't agree that it would leave the victims of police misconduct.
Well, let me share with you some aspects.
Without any remedy at all.
I'm reclaiming my time. Let me share with you some aspects of profiling. After the death of George Floyd found that while black people make up 19% of the Minneapolis population and 9% of its police, they were on the receiving end of 58% of the city's police use of force incidents. In addition, we've seen that black men are twice as likely to be stopped and searched. Hispanic drivers, 65% to receive a ticket, and Native Americans in Arizona 3 times more likely to search and be stopped. Let me ask you the questions of how we respond to that. The Justice Department has many tools at its disposal to reduce police violence, the pattern or practice investigations, a practice to end bad policing and police violence. It addresses police violence at an institution level rather than just focuses on acute cases. If you understand that, then why has your department only pursued one pattern or practice investigation since President Trump took office that could stop systemic racism?
If you read my statement or listened to my statement, I did specifically acknowledge that there was a difficulty in this country with the African American community.
Mr. Attorney General, I have short time.
Well,
Can you just tell me why you have not done a pattern in practice? What was the reason?
And you asked me what I thought the response was, and I thought the response to this is, in fact, training of police. And I think the police believe that that's a response. I was talking to a black
Then let
chief
me continue.
of police.
Mr. Attorney General, I want to respect you, but I have a short time. For example, 18 U.S.C. Section 242, which makes unlawful the denial of rights under the color of law. Can you defend the fact that in the first 7 months of FY 2020, federal prosecutors filed only 242 charges in just 27 cases in the Trump DOJ? And were you aware that in FY 2019, federal prosecutors brought Section 242 charges in just 49 cases in the United States? And are you aware of how many cases we've had? 184,274, which means that in FY 2019, only about 27 out of every 100,000 prosecutions was related to Section 242 charges. Do you have a reason for that?
Yeah, yes, I do. I will get you the numbers on it. I don't know them off the top of my head, but actually our criminal prosecutions under 241 and 242 are extremely strong and are comparable to, if not exceed, prior administrations. But at the beginning of this year, most of the, very few jurisdictions had grand juries that were open. No grand juries.
I think the reason is because it was really skinny. It was not your focus. Your focus was more to let out friends like Roger Stone and Paul Manafort, while Tamir Rice, whose case has not been taken up, was playing with a toy gun, was killed by police at the age of 12. Breonna Taylor was sleeping in her apartment when she was killed by police at age 26. And Rashad Brooks, 27, was killed just for sleeping in his car in a Wendy's parking lot. And George Floyd from Houston, Texas, known as a humble man, was murdered in the streets of Minneapolis crying, "I can't breathe." I would hope that the DOJ would focus on systemic institutional racism because there is good policing. That's what we're trying to do in the Justice and the Judiciary Committee, and that's what we need you to join us on, Mr. Attorney General, and to recognize that institutional racism does exist, and until we accept that, we will not finish our job and reach the goals and aspirations of our late iconic John Lewis. With that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Gomer.
Attorney General Barr, we've been hearing about these peaceful protests in major cities around the country, controlled by Democratic mayors and city councils. You've had a lot of experience. Have you ever seen so many people hurt, injured, and killed at peaceful protests in your life?
I haven't seen it, no, not at a peaceful protest. Obviously, as I've said from the beginning, these peaceful protests in many places are being hijacked by a very hardcore of instigators, violent instigators. And they become violent, and their primary direction of violence is to injure police. Police casualties far exceed anything on the civilian side.
Weren't there over 50 police injured in Chicago just in the recent days? And now I'm hearing this allegation that this administration is helping spread coronavirus, COVID-19, and yet these are some of the same people that just castigated the president for shutting down travel from the location where the virus was coming from. And now some seem more interested in defending the Chinese Communist Party than they are our own country. But what occurred to me, hearing this allegation about this administration helping spread COVID, would it be a good idea then perhaps, if that's the big concern here, that maybe the federal government should shut down the protests during this COVID-19 spread so that we can satisfy our colleagues that you're doing more to stop it? Has that ever been a consideration?
No, I've never considered that.
Well, it would apparently stop some of the allegations being thrown here. Now, I know you know history. Going back to 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Mao Revolution, some of these tactics we're seeing are not new. Trying to get, even David Horowitz, I introduced one time as a former socialist, he said, no, I was a full-blown communist. But he has pointed out that he started looking away from the group he was in because he saw they were interested in trying to provoke the police to kill somebody so that they could really create mayhem. You're familiar with that tactic by Marxists, are you not?
Yes.
It is a dangerous time. Well, let me ask you, I know you know that U.S. attorneys are supposed to serve at the pleasure of the president. You know, Bill Clinton fired 93 U.S. attorneys on the same day. Do you know what made U.S. Attorney Berman think that he was the exception who did not serve at the pleasure of the president? What caused him to think he owned that position?
I think part of it was he seems to have had the view that because he was court appointed, and there is a provision in law for court appointment of a U.S. attorney as essentially a placeholder until the administration gets somebody, that he felt he could not be removed by the president because he was court appointed, and that's not correct.
Yeah, and some judges fail to know what my constitutional law professor knew, and that is that all courts federal courts except for one owe their existence and continuation and jurisdiction to the U.S. Congress. Hopefully, Mr. Berman will figure that out at some point. Now, is Bruce Orr still working for the FBI?
He works for the Department of Justice.
Well, we have heard so much information about his basically being the go-between between the DNC, the Clinton campaign, Fusion GPS, Christopher Steele, the Russian propaganda that were incorporated into his dossier. And I know Kleinsmith, Christopher Wray, indicated he had been given the chance to resign, go get a better job. I'm wondering how long Bruce Orr is going to be staying where he is. It's incredible to me that he's still there.
Well, I can't talk about, individual personnel matters.
Well, thank you for your service. I'm sorry for the abuse you've taken when you're just trying to do your job. Appreciate it very much. You're back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Barr, I'm the chairman of the Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties, so this is most pertinent hearing to me. Firstly, I'd like to ask you if you will work with us and allow the head of the Civil Rights Division, Assistant Attorney General Eric Dryband, to testify before this committee this fall.
I'll talk to him about it.
Will you encourage him?
I'll talk to him about it.
All right. I've closely watched actions taken by the federal government at Lafayette Park in June and currently in Portland, Oregon. According to a DOJ document dated June 4, received by this committee, 1,500 federal agents from 10 different agencies were deployed to confront protesters in Washington, D.C. At Lafayette Park, which has long been honored and accepted as a place of protest in our nation's capital, on the first day of June, the world watched in horror on live television as federal agents deployed by the administration and with you present and telling him to get it done, used force to clear Lafayette Park so that the president, with you and others at your side, could walk across the park and have a photo op in front of St. John's Church. This was anathema to the bishop of the diocese and the rector of the church. It was also an affront to the Constitution and to the American people. Given the timing and the coordinated attack against the peaceful demonstrators, it strains credulity that this was not planned for use of political purposes. And just yesterday, Major DeMarco testified to another committee of Congress that the protesters were peaceful, and that's what the majority of people have said, and the response was excessive. When did you first learn that the president planned to walk through the park and go to St. John's Church?
First, I'd like to respond to what you said.
Would you please answer my question? My time is limited.
I learned sometime in the afternoon that the president might come out of the White House, and then later in the afternoon, I heard that he might go over to the church.
So it was absolutely necessary the park be cleared for his walk.
No, that had nothing to do with that. The plan to move
Mr.
the plan to
General,
move the
it was
perimeter
necessary that the park be cleared, and it was done. And you said, get it done.
Well,
I have the time. Thank you. In Portland, we've seen mothers and we've seen veterans who were peacefully protesting, not threatening the federal courthouse, beaten and gassed. Unidentified armed federal agents violently attacked demonstrators in a violation of the First Amendment's freedom of assembly and arrested citizens without individualized suspicion in a violation of the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures and a warrant requirement. You've gone through the Fifth Amendment and due process and just negated it. And the 10th Amendment, which leaves general policing to the law enforcement, to the states, has been forgotten. Maybe what happened was your secret police were poorly trained, just like your Bureau of Prisons guards were poorly trained and allowed the most notorious
inmate in our nation's last several years, Jeffrey Epstein, to conveniently commit suicide. Sad. You misled Congress and the American people about Special Counsel Mueller's findings with your, quote, summary, unquote, of his report. It was issued about a month before you released the redacted portion of the Mueller report. But you set the stage. You set the stage such that the Special Counsel objected to the accuracy of how it was reported by the press and what you said. And federal judge Reggie Walton, appointed by George W. Bush, declared in a ruling that your summary was, quote, distorted, unquote, and misleading, unquote, and that the court could not trust you. Further, Judge Walton stated your report was, quote, a calculated attempt to influence public disclosure about the Mueller report in favor of President Trump, unquote. This committee still does not have the unredacted Mueller report. America has still not seen the unredacted Mueller report. Your excuses for not releasing it because it had to do with ongoing cases no longer exist because those ongoing cases have been completed or commuted or finished. Other attorney generals work with this Judiciary Committee to see that the American public and that the Judiciary Committee had unredacted copies of that report. You have not. You've gone to court to stall it. This report needs to be given to. In Michael Cohen, you've treated him differently than Michael Flynn and Roger Stone. In Michael Flynn, you've attempted to dismiss the charges, even after he twice pled guilty. And in Roger Stone, you went further. Mr. Barr, John Lewis said to us, if not me, who? If not now, when? That's why I introduced H.Res. 1032, which would require this committee to investigate your conduct as Attorney General and determine whether you should be impeached. That is my constitutional duty. I yield back the balance of my time.
May I respond to these?
I seek recognition.
I'm sorry, what did you?
I would like to
Chair
seek
recognizes Mr. Cohen.
recognition for unanimous consent requests.
Yes. You are
Thank you.
recognized.
I'd like to introduce for the record a Slate article entitled Why Trump Chose Portland, which describes the racial history of the state and the Portland Police Bureau. I'd also like to introduce an op-ed from Mary McCord, who writes her words were twisted to justify the department's disingenuous position to drop charges against Michael Flynn after he had already pled guilty. I'd like to introduce an op-ed from Jonathan Kravis, describing the political interference in the Roger Stone case and why he resigned from the Department of Justice. And I'd like to introduce a statement from over 2,600 former DOJ officials calling for Attorney General Barr's resignation because of his assault on the rule of law. And a letter from the New York City Bar urging Congress to commence formal inquiries into a pattern of conduct by Attorney General Barr that threatens public confidence in the fair and impartial administration of justice. And finally, a letter from 27 of the District of Columbia's most prominent attorneys and law professors, including 4 past presidents of the D.C. Bar, calling for an ethics investigation into Mr. Barr's conduct. And
With that
last but not
objection.
least, a letter from over 80% of the George Washington University Law School faculty, your alma mater, saying his actions have posed and continue to create a clear and present danger to the even-handed administration of justice, to civil liberties, and to the constitutional order.
Okay, without objection.
Madam Chair, one more unanimous consent request on this
Go
side.
ahead.
This is the article that says Representative Jerry Natler says Antifa violence in Portland is a myth. That's from Politico and a number of other journals. We'll put that
Without
in the record.
objection.
Thank you.
Mr. Collins is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome, Attorney General Barr. Wow. I'm beginning to believe, frankly, that you're probably that just hadn't come out yet, probably will in a little bit. You're probably the cause of the common cold and, and possibly even the COVID-19. I'm not sure at this point because everything's being thrown at you, including now, undoubtedly, your alma mater doesn't like you anymore. Where have we come? The chairman said something earlier today that really made me think. He said, why all the drama? That's the most ironic statement coming from this committee in the last 18 months that I've ever heard of, the drama that we're bringing up today. We're seeming to just contort ourselves to get to some way to show that you have a nefarious motive. I believe, like some of our side here, I believe the biggest problem you have is telling the truth. I believe that's the problem that they have with you. You'll tell the truth and you'll take responsibility for your actions, and I think that's why you're being attacked. But I want to continue just on this, quote, peaceful protest for a second. You made a comment just a second ago on these rights. Talking about the courthouses just down the street, what if they decided, do you think that this body right here would rise up if they decided to go tonight and paint the Capitol building?
This body, I'm not sure.
I think this side would. I'm not sure. Yeah, this other side, I'm not so sure. Maybe the peaceful protest to burn down the Capitol. Maybe we're back to 1812 again. But also, the other question I have is, and you've heard it earlier today, the stormtrooper comments by the Speaker of the House. And we know that that is a direct reference to the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party, stormtroopers going at it. Do you believe that that actually puts our law enforcement community at a whole? As a son of a state trooper, I want to know your opinion. Don't you think it encourages the violence that we're seeing and encourages the participation against the police?
I think that's possible, and I think it's irresponsible to call these federal law enforcement officers stormtroopers.
Yeah, and we're seeing that thing played out over and over. Let's switch back to something else, though, that is I think, more appealing here. We've talked about the investigations, and especially going with Flynn. Do you believe that there was actually a basis to go after General Flynn? I mean, what we've seen so far, what's been released, and especially keeping an investigation open, Peter Strzok kept it open. Do you believe there's actually a basis for the beginning of this investigation to start with, or continuing it?
Well, I would just say, I asked another U.S. attorney in St. Louis who had 10 years in the FBI and 10 years in the Department of Justice as a career prosecutor to take a look at it, and he determined, based on documents that had not been provided to Flynn's side and not been provided to the court, that in fact there was no basis to investigate Flynn. And furthermore, it was clearly established by the documents that the FBI agents who interviewed him did not believe that he thought he was lying.
Well, there's another part of this as well that concerns what has been given to the courts and the interviews, and that is that the facts were not disclosed to Flynn prior to the interview. That seems like a Brady violation to me. Do you believe that there's a Brady violation there in this case?
No, there wasn't a Brady violation there, but I think what the counsel concluded was that the only purpose of the interview, the only purpose, was to try to catch him in saying something that they could then say was a lie.
So it was an entrapment?
And therefore there was not a legit, the interview was untethered to any legitimate investigation.
So as the law enforcement officer in this country, it is your responsibility to provide justice for both sides, not, and just call it as it should be. And I think that's what you've done there. Continuing on Durham case, and I know we're not talking specifically about the Durham investigation, which we're hopeful of, but to your knowledge, and we're seeing some released documents in the last week or two that have said, to your knowledge, has Kevin Kleinsmith or anyone else at FBI or DOJ who was previously there, attempted to redeem themselves by cooperating with the investigation? It's been slow, and I
can't get into that.
Okay, I understand that. Well, I have another issue as we finish up in looking at this between the rhetoric, between the investigation. I think Durham investigation is something most of us are waited for, because we can't seem to get this committee to actually believe that the IG's report is worth having something about this committee. And there's not a Democrat or Republican on the side that can make a legitimate claim why the Inspector General has not been called before this committee to actually explain his report, except politics. And that's what this committee has become all along. But I have another problem, and I've written to you about this, and that's down with the district attorney down in Fulton County, Georgia, actually making felony murder charges on an officer. And the interesting part about this is what we do as prosecutors do, but were you aware that the district attorney failed to seek an indictment from a grand jury or even waited for a GBI investigation to finish before bringing those charges? Were you aware of that?
Yes, I was.
Okay. As an attorney, and again, looking at this with the environment we have right now with police officers constantly under attack from this committee and from others in all over the country, and especially from the Speaker of the House, as an attorney and especially a prosecutor, do you think it's appropriate to charge a law enforcement officer with a crime as severe as felony murder without giving the investigation more than a mere days and without obtaining an indictment from the grand jury, and while you announce the charges, lay out a case that is full of falsehoods?
I've said that I would have preferred that he had used the grand jury and had waited till the Georgia Bureau had completed its investigation.
I appreciate your help in that, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. With that, the chair recognizes Mr. Johnson from Georgia.
Thank you. General Barr, your opening statement reads like it was written by Alex Jones or Roger Stone. Do you stand by that statement?
Yes.
Now, I'm sure that we can agree on some things. We disagree on a whole lot, but I'm sure we can agree on the fact that President Trump is just a prolific tweeter. Isn't that correct?
He seems to be.
And he tweeted many times about the Roger Stone sentencing, didn't he?
I don't know how many times he tweeted about it.
Well, many times. You are aware of them because you said it with it hurts you from doing your job. And isn't it true that when prosecutors in the Roger Stone case filed a memo with the court recommending a sentence of 7 to 9 years in prison, a few hours later, President Trump tweeted that the sentence recommendation was, quote, a disgrace? You're aware of that?
Yes.
And General Barr, several hours after that, you filed a pleading with the court stating that the sentence recommendation would be changed and that you would be asking for a lighter sentence for Roger Stone. Isn't that correct?
No, what is correct is that, what is correct that on February 10th, Monday, I gave instructions as to what the...
Reclaiming my time.
Yeah, I'm answering your question.
Well, you gotta let him answer.
Reclaiming my time, you filed a sentencing recommendation hours after President Trump tweeted his dissatisfaction with the Stone recommendation, and you changed that recommendation.
No, the night before, that is Monday night.
I know your story, but I'm asking.
Well, I'm telling my story. That's what I'm here to do. Well, I do. That's why I'm here. Well, I'm here to tell my story. And on the night before, on February 10th,
sir,
on February 10th, I directed.
Reclaiming my time, sir. Reclaiming my time, and I know you don't want to answer, but the facts are clear. Sentencing recommendation made in the morning, tweet in the afternoon, you changed the sentencing recommendation that...
No, tweet was not made in the afternoon. The tweet was made at, I think, 1:30 or 2 in the morning.
Well, the tweet was made before and after. Tweeted about that relentlessly, and you've agreed to that. Now, when you filed your sentencing recommendation asking for a lower sentence...
I didn't ask for a lower sentence.
Well, you said that you were going to recommend a lower sentence, and you...
No,
wasn't the sentence that was recommended by the line prosecutors according to the sentencing guideline calculations?
It was within the guidelines, but it was not within Justice Department policy, in my view.
General Barr, you're expecting the American people to believe that you did not do what Trump wanted you to do when you changed that sentencing recommendation and lowered it for Roger Stone. You think the American people don't understand that you were carrying out Trump's...
I had not discussed my sentencing recommendation with anyone at the White House or anyone outside the department.
The president wanted you to do, and that's what you did.
No.
Attorney General,
let me ask you, do you think it's fair? Do you think it is fair for a 67-year-old man to be sent to prison for 7 to 9 years?
It was in accordance with the sentencing.
No, it was not.
You just said that it was. And your line prosecutors will testify that it was also. Now, I'm going to move on from that.
The department...
During your time as Attorney General for Herbert Walker Bush, you never changed the sentencing recommendation for a friend of Herbert Walker Bush, did you?
No, as I recall...
All right, that's all I'm asking. No. And over the course of your time as Trump...
nothing was never elevated to me.
Over the course of your tenure with Trump, you've changed 2 sentencing recommendations, not 1, but 2. Correct?
Which were they?
Yeah, Michael Flynn.
I didn't change it.
Well, you indicated that you changed it because the original Flynn sentencing recommendation was for Flynn to serve 0 to 6 months. But under your authority, the Justice Department supplemented that recommendation with a pleading that stated the Department of Justice's agreement with Flynn's lawyers that probation would be a reasonable sentence and that the DOJ would not be seeking prison time for Michael Flynn. Isn't that correct?
I don't think that's what it said.
Well, that's what it said, sir. You go back and read it.
I think both pleadings said that...
Reclaiming my time, prior to you becoming...
The gentleman's time has expired.
Madam Chair, you can give a speech or you can ask questions. If you do the latter, you need to let the witness answer the questions. And that's the chair's obligation, chair's responsibility to allow that to happen.
Mr. Buck is recognized for 5 minutes.
Attorney General Barr, thank you for appearing before the committee today. General Barr, there is a disturbing pattern we've seen throughout history with totalitarian systems of government. The leaders first seek to disarm the population Then they encourage goon squads to suppress opposing voices. And finally, once they have disarmed and silenced the opposition, these authoritarian leaders institute policies that root out and crush freedom in every form. Unfortunately, the American left has been infected with the same totalitarian desire to remove firearms and silence opposing views as part of a campaign to achieve its political ends. We've seen this scenario play out in every major Democrat-run city in America. Progressive leaders push to disarm law-abiding Americans to further their influence while watching as crime rates soar. We even saw failed presidential and Senate candidate Beto O'Rourke proudly tell Americans, hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15 and your AK-47. Now the American left is actively cheering as its fascist militia Antifa rages in the streets. Antifa is a domestic terrorist organization that hijacks peaceful rallies, organizes armed riots, attacks peaceful protesters, burns buildings, loots stores, and spreads hate. Reports of Antifa-linked attacks began circulating in 2017. These thugs, often armed with sticks and pepper spray and other instruments, showed up to silence college Republican groups at Berkeley. The left was silent. Then in June 2019, Antifa jumped into the national conversation after journalist Andy Ngo was brutally attacked in Portland. No arrests were made. The left again was silent. Almost exactly 1 year ago today, the Wall Street Journal ran an op-ed stating Portland has to do something to deter political violence or the city will get more of it. Of course, the city's feckless leadership has only further encouraged Antifa's violent antics. As a result, we've seen 61 straight nights of violence in Portland. Antifa's fascist totalitarian activities are now oozing into other Democrat-run cities. Last Sunday, Antifa launched a violent assault on a peaceful pro-police demonstration in Denver, Colorado. Conservative leaders in Colorado, including Randy Corcoran, a Denver area lawyer and radio talk show host, organized a family-friendly event in honor of Law Enforcement Appreciation Day. The atmosphere was peaceful, and counter-protesters were given plenty of space to advocate their message. But as the afternoon wore on, a swarm of violent Antifa thugs infiltrated the peaceful Black Lives Matter counter-protesters and began assaulting pro-police Americans. These are 20 and 30-year-old thugs assaulting 50, 60, 70, and even 80-year-old Americans who only wanted to show their support for law enforcement. What's worse, Denver's cowardly liberal leadership ordered police to retreat once they saw members of Antifa entering the fray. A Denver police detective, Nick Rogers, apologized for this terrible decision. Detective Rogers summed it up best in a recent radio interview, quote, "I'm sorry on behalf of the rank and file. That's not us. That's not who we are. It just kills me that we let good people down." He continued, "I found out that a retreat order was given by the incident commander, and we had one lieutenant step up and say, 'We aren't leaving.' This lieutenant said, 'These people are going to get killed if we don't stay.' So he kept his people there. That's the reason this thing didn't get worse." End of quote. These are sad times in America. Free speech and the right to keep and bear arms are both being threatened by violent anarchists, and the best our chairman can do is call Antifa a myth. General Barr, this has to stop. We can't let Antifa continue terrorizing our country. Can you please tell us about the appropriate use of civil and criminal RICO statutes to address violent criminal groups like Antifa?
In the wake of the beginning of these riots, I asked our joint terrorism task forces, the FBI's joint terrorism task forces around the country, to be our principal means of developing evidence and prosecuting violent extremist terrorists who are involved in these activities. And one of the tools, obviously, we would use is RICO, which can be used against an organization. But that doesn't mean that we currently have a RICO case pending.
Okay. I thank the gentleman. And do you have anything you want to say in response to the speeches that have been given by the other side, and then you've been cut off?
Yeah, well, let's, on Lafayette.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Could I ask for a brief recess?
Yeah, Madam Chair, the witness like a break.
Mr. Barr, Mr. Barr, Mr. Barr, 10 minutes?
for a brief.
10 minutes?
5.
Okay.
Recess for 5 minutes.
The committee will stand in recess for 5 minutes. The committee's in recess, sir. Committee is in session. The chair recognizes Mr. Deutsch for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Attorney General Barr, you just told us that nothing was ever elevated to me. You had said in an interview recently that there's a process in place, an escalation system. It's the AG's responsibility to resolve it. How was this elevated to you, the case of Roger Stone?
A Monday, February 10th, the U.S. Attorney was with me, and he raised the issue with me.
So it was
He was-
elevated by Timothy Shea.
Yes.
And had it been elevated during the 2 months between the time the conviction came in under the former U.S. Attorney and the time that Timothy Shea started?
I think Shea may have had conversations with people in the.
Now, did you ever have conversations with the former U.S. Attorney about this case? About the sentencing?
I don't recall any discussion about Stone with.
Right.
With
So Timothy Shea, you said in the interview that he was new, he had just started. He was new, but he worked for you for a long time, didn't he?
Yes.
And what was his job for you?
Well, when I was Attorney General 30 years ago, he worked.
No, now, just now.
He was on my staff.
He advised you on criminal justice policy and law enforcement, right?
Correct.
And you named him acting U.S. Attorney. Had you discussed the Stone case with him before you named him acting U.S. Attorney?
No.
Did you discuss sentencing with him? Not before. The first time was when he came in. It wasn't Monday, actually. Just to refresh your recollection, in a prior interview, you said he came in the week before. He came in to see some senior staff. That's what you.
No, that's what I said. He may have had discussions with people in the deputy's office. I was not involved in those discussions. Basically, I didn't, as far as I can recall, I had no substantive involvement in Stone until that Monday when he came in the morning.
Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Attorney General, the week before when he came in to see the senior staff that he had worked with the week before when he was working on.
No, I said I think he had raised it with people in the deputy's office. That's senior staff too.
Right, I understand.
But I was not involved.
He started on July 31st. The first week he was there, he came to raise this issue.
I think he started February 1st.
Right. The first week he was there, he came into your office to raise the issue of sentencing. In the interview you did with ABC, you said
I don't think he came.
That's what you told ABC News. You said that he's talked to senior staff, not you perhaps, but he talked to senior staff. I don't know what,
I think I speak English. I said that before he came in to see me, I believe he had some conversations
with senior staff, right? That's right, before he came to see you. We're saying the same thing.
But the first it was raised with me
was on Monday. Did you talk to the senior staff after they spoke with him?
I think at a 9 o'clock meeting, they said that he was trying to work something out on sentencing, and he was actually optimistic that something could be worked out. So I didn't really think of it as an issue until that Monday when he told me that prosecutors.
He filed the sentencing memo, and the sentencing memo called for 7 to 9 years. It's the policy of the U.S. Attorney's Office to suggest a specific guideline range, which they did, and then you overruled the line prosecutors. They asked for a lower sentence, and you gave some reasons. You talked about health. Health is to be considered only for an extraordinary physical impairment. Did that apply to Roger Stone, Mr. Attorney General? That's what the guidelines said.
Well, actually, I can't reveal all the information.
I'm not asking what his health was, but did that apply?
No.
Okay,
did what apply?
His health. Was that the reason?
Health is a reason to.
I know. Is that the case? Is that the reason for Roger Stone? Where you're asking for a lower sentence. Let me go on. It says age. Let me go on. Age. Hold on one second. Age can be consideration. It says only if it creates conditions that are of an unusual degree and distinguish the case from typical cases. He was 67.
The judge agreed with me, Congressman.
No, that's not what I'm asking. I'm not asking you that.
The judge agreed with me.
I'm not asking whether.
I know you're not asking.
I'm not asking you that. And the issue here is whether Roger Stone was treated differently because he was friends with the president. When you asked to reduce the sentence, you said enhancements were technically applicable. Mr. Attorney General, can you think of any other cases where the defendant threatened to kill a witness, threatened a judge, lied to a judge, where the Department of Justice claimed that those were mere technicalities? Can you think of even one?
The judge agreed with our
analysis. Can you think of even one? I'm not asking about the judge. I'm asking about what you did to reduce the sentence of Roger Stone.
Yes.
Can you think, Mr. Attorney General, he threatened the life of a witness.
And the witness
and
said
you
he didn't
view that
feel
as
threatened.
a technicality, Mr. Attorney General. Is there another time
Can I answer the question?
Happened?
Can I have just a few seconds to answer the question?
Sure. I'm asking if there's another time in all the time of the Justice Department.
The judge agreed with
you won't answer my question, Mr. Attorney General, and it's unfortunate. And the appearance is that, as you said earlier, this is exactly what you want. The essence of rule of law is that we have one rule for everybody, and we don't in this case because he's a friend of the president's. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, Ms. Roby.
Mr. Attorney General, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm a member of both this committee as well as the Appropriations Committee, and I've been able to see firsthand both the funding and the operation of the department. Additionally, before I was elected to Congress, I served on the City Council in my hometown of Montgomery, Alabama. And I've witnessed the importance and the value of various Justice Department grant programs and the resources to state and local governments. For example, the Alabama Fusion Center, which is designed to combine information between federal, state, and local government, private sector entities, and the intelligence community, has been a recipient of these federal grants. And the Alabama Fusion Center is also responsible for the Alabama Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and has done a great job in work in combating child exploitation. Do you believe that Congress is adequately funding programs that provide state and local agencies with the tools that they need to be effective in preventing and pursuing crimes such as child exploitation and human trafficking, particularly over the internet?
I think we could always use more resources for that, Congressman, but if I could just have a moment of your time to respond to these questions here on that were being asked about the Roger Stone sentencing. The U.S. Attorney came to me and said that the 4 line prosecutors were threatening to resign unless they could recommend 7 to 9 years. But there was no comparable case to support that. It would have been a very disparate sentence. All the cases were clustered around 3-year sentence for that. And the way they had gotten to the 7 to 9 was by applying an enhancement. And there are debates all the time within the Department of Justice about the proper calculations under the guidelines and whether a particular enhancement applies or doesn't apply. And those are usually worked out and resolved. But here they were saying that they were taking an enhancement that has traditionally been applied to mafioso and things like that, threatening a witness, and they were applying it to him because he had a phone call at night where he told a witness that if you want to get it on, let's get it on, and I'll take your dog. And we felt that that technically could apply, but in this case, it really didn't reflect the underlying conduct. And the overarching requirement at the Department of Justice is that we do not presume and automatically apply the guidelines. We make individual assessments of the defendant and what is really just under the case, and nothing that is excessive. And these individuals were trying to force the U.S. Attorney, who was new in the office, to adopt 7 to 9. And I made the decision, no, we are going to leave it up to the judge. And that later, when that was not done, that evening, I told people we had to go back and correct that the next morning. So that's the sequence of events. But at the end of the day, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The judge said she would not have gone along, she didn't think, with the first recommendation because the enhancement artificially inflated the exposure of the defendant. And she came out exactly where I had come out. So at the end of the day, the question is fairness to the individual. And even though I was going to get a lot of criticism at the end of for doing that, I think at the end of the day, my obligation is to be fair to the individual. Thank you for permitting me.
Yeah, I'm happy to have yielded you time to respond. That being said, Mr. Attorney General, as I am a departing member of Congress and have just a few short moments left, I just want to express to you in the department how important this issue that I originally asked you about is to me, both as a member of Congress representing my constituents in Alabama, but also as a mother of 2 beautiful children. And I am increasingly alarmed about the way that children are just 1 click away from being on a website, a forum, or a chat room, or a social media site where bad actors may be lurking. And whereas I only have a few short seconds left, I would just ask you in the time that I have left in Congress that we could continue to work together to combat child exploitation and human trafficking, and I appreciate all the work that you're doing on this.
Absolutely, Congresswoman, and as you know, one of the most difficult issues coming up is encryption, because as this material gets encrypted in the chat rooms and the areas where they groom these young children, once it becomes encrypted, it'll be very hard for us to police it.
Right. Thank you so much. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. Ms. Bass.
Attorney General Barr, when it comes to police engagement, last August when speaking to the National Fraternal Order of Police, you shared your views on police engagement with the public. You stated, and I quote, "Underscore the need to comply first, and if warranted, complain later. This will make everyone safe, the police suspects, and the community at large, and those who resist must be prosecuted. I repeat, zero tolerance for resisting police. This will save lives." Do you stand by that statement?
Yes, I think it's very important.
A zero tolerance attitude is costing lives, not saving them, especially in communities of color.
Well, I'm not saying that.
I reclaim my time. A movement and protests have arisen in response to police brutality. Here are a few examples of who bears the cost of zero tolerance. Elijah McClain was walking home from a convenience store when he was approached by police. He had not committed a crime. Police held him in a chokehold for 15 minutes, then injected him with ketamine, not under a doctor's supervision, but at the direction of non-medically trained and unlicensed police officers. Are you familiar with that case?
No.
Do you know how frequently ketamine is used by law enforcement to subdue civilians, especially people of color?
No.
Did you know if police departments have been documented as directing paramedics and EMTs to inject ketamine during arrests?
No.
Have you, well then, I guess you haven't evaluated the use of force tactics since becoming AG, and especially this particular tactic of subduing suspects with ketamine.
Not with respect to ketamine, no.
Will you commit to directing the department to evaluate the protocols around the use of ketamine, chokeholds, and other methods used by federal law enforcement officials when making arrests or detaining subjects?
Well, absolutely. Under the president's executive order, we are reviewing
Thank you. And especially
use of force and working with police departments.
Especially the ketamine. That's pretty outrageous. George Floyd was killed by a police officer via a chokehold. For 8 minutes and 46 seconds, a police officer knelt on his neck as he begged for his life. He was suspected of using a counterfeit $20 bill. That's how zero tolerance can amount to a death sentence for black men when used in communities of color. With George Floyd screaming, as we all know, he couldn't breathe. Now consider James Holmes, who murdered 12 people and injured 70 others in a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, the same town as Elijah McClain, where he was arrested. James wore body armor, had a knife, semi-automatic weapons, and an AR-15. Yet he was calmly arrested by the same police department as Elijah McClain without a chokehold or an injection of ketamine. Dylan Roof used a gun to murder 9 people and injured another at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in South Carolina. When he was arrested, no chokeholds, no injections, he was treated so well that officers brought Dylan Roof Burger King after arresting him. Are you familiar with that case?
Yes.
I raised those 2 examples to follow up on what my colleague from Texas highlighted earlier, that the department is not doing enough to address issues of racism, bias, and brutality in law enforcement. When someone who commits mass murder is calmly arrested and served Burger King, while a young man walking down the street is placed in a chokehold and injected with ketamine, then dies. You said that under the executive order, the administration is looking at chokeholds. What have you determined so far?
Well, we're setting up a system of certification of police departments, and part of what our charter is to come up with criteria that will be used for certification, including limitations on use of force, specifically including chokeholds.
So in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, part of it called for a national registry of law enforcement officers as a resource for police chiefs to determine who are the best candidates for jobs. As you may or may not be aware, Tamir Rice might be alive today if the police chief who hired him had known that that police officer had been fired from another department. What is your view of a national registry of law enforcement officers?
The second aspect of the president's executive order is to set up a database like that so that all determinations of excessive force around the country go into that database. And if police departments aren't reporting that information, they wouldn't be certified. So we do believe in one national point where you can go in and get determinations of excessive force on law enforcement candidates for jobs.
Good, thank you. And I do want to comment on part of your opening statement when you were saying that after the Jim Crow period, that our justice system was equal. And I don't believe that that's the case.
I said the laws were made equal.
The laws are made equal. They are certainly not applied equally. We do have systemic problems in our law enforcement system, our criminal justice system on every level. The fact of the matter is 2.3 million people in the United States are incarcerated. We incarcerate 24% of the world's prisoners. 34% are black, while African Americans are just 13% of the U.S. population. So justice is still not equal, nor are our laws. And I think when we look at how many people are incarcerated or how many people are killed, it is not the numbers, it is the percentage to the percentage of that group in the U.S. population. I yield back the time.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Attorney General, you've described the prosecution of Roger Stone as righteous. That's clearly something that the President and I disagree with you on. I would suggest that perhaps the prosecution of Andrew McCabe, who lied 4 times, thrice under the penalty of perjury, would be more righteous. I would suggest to you that uncovering the criminal conspiracy that existed where people in our own government were trying to convince intelligence agents and operatives around the world to destabilize our elections and to discredit our president would perhaps be more righteous. But as we sit here today, I don't think that Mr. Stone or Mr. McCabe or any of those other folks are killing anyone or burning down our buildings. And so I'd like to focus our effort on the most acute need I believe our country has. You've recently said that you believe Antifa to be a terrorist organization. What's your basis for that belief?
I'm not sure I said terrorist organization. I said we're investigating it as domestic terrorism. But Antifa, there are a number of violent extreme groups in the United States, and they're across the spectrum. Antifa is heavily represented in the recent riots. That's not to say they're the only group involved. And they have been identified as involved in a number of the violent mob actions that have taken place around the country.
And Mr. Attorney General, I saw the chairman of the Judiciary Committee recently say that Antifa is a myth, that their involvement in this violence isn't something that is real. What's your reaction to the chairman?
Well, I don't think it's a myth. Antifa can be best thought of, I think, as a umbrella term for what is essentially a movement comprised of loosely organized groups around the country. In some areas of the country, there are a number of groups, and there are sort of centers of activity. The groups, as I say, are loosely organized, but they are definitely organized. But since they have an anarchic temperament, they don't get along very well with each other. So I'm not suggesting it's a national organization that moves nationally. They tend to get organized for an event, and there's a lot of organization right before an event occurs, but we see a lot of the organization during the mob violence.
And that is a really important distinction when determining how to apply particularly our RICO laws to an organization like this. If Antifa is merely something that inspires people to go out and commit violence, that strikes me as legally distinct from Antifa being an organizing influence to assist people in committing crimes. One question I get from my constituents as they watch the death and violence and disruption and chaos in Seattle and in Portland and in other places is whether or not there's a risk that could metastasize to other areas of the country. Have you given consideration to the risk that might befall other American communities if the Department of Justice were not to take action to protect and preserve federal property in places like Portland?
Yes, absolutely. You know, we are concerned about this problem metastasizing around the country. And so we feel that we have to, in a place like Portland, where even where we don't have the support of the state, the local government, we have to take a stand and defend this federal property. We can't get to a level where we're going to accept these kinds of violent attacks on federal courts.
And if you did what my Democrat colleagues were asking, if you merely abandoned that federal property, allowed it to be overrun, allowed the people inside to be harmed, is it your view then that Antifa and other violent people engaged in these acts would simply stop, would simply accept that as their sole victory? Or is it your expert opinion, having dealt with a number of law enforcement and criminal cases in your legal career, that they wouldn't stop, that they would go to the next town, to the next community, and potentially inspire more violence?
There's no doubt in my mind that it would spread.
And what comfort can you give Americans in my district and around the country that you will stop this, that you will stop the burning and destruction of federal property, and that you will give confidence to regular Americans that they can go out in the streets without the risk of this terrorism?
Well, as you can see in Portland, we have a relatively small number of federal officers who have been withstanding this for almost 2 months. It's a great strain, but we cannot just stand aside and allow the federal court to be destroyed.
Thank you for your service and for your great work. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Attorney General Barr, you started your testimony with eloquent words about the life and legacy of John Lewis, fighting systematic racism, voter intimidation, civil rights. The one thing that you have in common with your two predecessors, both Attorney General Sessions and Attorney General Whitaker, is that when you all came here and brought your top staff, you brought no black people. That, sir, is systematic racism. That is exactly what John Lewis spent his life fighting. And so I would just suggest that actions speak louder than words, and you really should keep the name of the Honorable John Lewis out of the Department of Justice's mouth. Let me also say, you mentioned bogus Russiagate. In your opinion, as the Attorney General of the United States of America, did Russia interfere or attempt to interfere in the 2016 election?
Yes.
In your position as the Attorney General of the United States, is Russia attempting to interfere in the 2020 presidential election?
I think we have to assume that they are.
Thank you, sir. Now, let's talk about the integrity of the election, which is also something Congressman Lewis fought for. Jared Kushner implied that the president could move the election day. Can a sitting U.S. president move an election day?
Actually, I haven't looked into that question under the Constitution.
Well, 2 U.S. Code Section 7 says federal election day is the Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So if you take that as a correct statute, is there any executive action by a president?
I've never been asked the question before. I've never looked into it.
As Attorney General of the United States, do you believe that this 2020 presidential election will be rigged?
I have no reason to think it will be.
President Trump tweeted that the election will be rigged, but he also tweeted that when he was losing to Hillary Clinton, and he tweeted that the day after Fox showed that he was losing to Trump. But I don't want to be too political. Do you believe, as the Attorney General of the United States, that mail-in voting will lead to massive voter fraud?
I think there's a high risk that it will.
Do you ever vote by mail-in ballot?
Apparently I did once at least.
But you believe that other people voting by mail could lead to massive fraud?
No, what I've talked about, made very clear, is that I'm not talking about accommodations to people who have to be out of the state or have some particular need not to, inability to go and vote. What I'm talking about is the wholesale conversion of election to mail-in voting.
You do understand that African Americans disproportionately do not survive COVID-19 coronavirus. You are aware of that?
I didn't hear the question.
You are aware that African Americans, black people, disproportionately die from COVID-19 coronavirus, correct?
Yes, I think that's right.
And not that it would be the first time that African Americans would risk their lives to vote in this country to preserve its democracy. But the suggestion is that them having the ability to vote by mail would somehow lead to massive voter fraud, but I won't stick to that.
No, I didn't say that. I just state, I think, what is a reality, which is that if you have wholesale mail-in voting, it substantially increases the risk of fraud.
But it doesn't make it likely.
That's all I said.
Now, I also saw on TV that the president said he's not sure that he'll accept the election results. Can a president just protest because he lost an election?
Protest in what sense?
Well, can he contest an election just because he simply loses?
Gore versus Bush v. Gore was.
Well, I think that was over a slim voter margin. I'm talking about if it is very clear that the president has lost an election, does he have a remedy to contest the election?
Not that I'm aware of.
Let me go back to what Representative Bass mentioned. You mentioned the number that there were 8 African Americans killed by the police and 11 white people killed by the police. If you use those numbers, that's 85% of that population is white, 15% of that population is black. But if you actually look at the deaths, according to the numbers you just gave, 42% of the deaths are African American and 58% are white. That is a glaring disparity in terms of population, and I just give you those numbers.
Well, not necessarily.
Because
I
I
have to adjust it by the race of the criminal perpetrator.
No, I just did that for you. I'm using your numbers, and according to your numbers, African Americans are 4 or 5 times more likely than their percentage of the population to be killed by police than their white counterparts. I just wanted to give you that based on your numbers.
Actually, the studies I've seen have suggested 2 things. One, that in fact, police are less likely to shoot at a black suspect, a little bit more likely to shoot at white. However, that police are more inclined to use non-lethal force in a contact with an African-American suspect. So those in terms of the statistics, that's what it looks like to me.
Any data that you have that shows that African Americans are less likely to die at the hands of police or be shot or shot at, to me is a incorrect analysis. But I am interested in seeing it. So if you have it, please see it. I won't call it any names. But if that data exists, I would be more than happy to see it. And since you're sending me that data, can you send me the data of African Americans within the Department of Justice? How many you have in leadership ranks all the way down? Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I would remind Mr. Jordan, Mr. Biggs, and Mr. Johnson to stop violating the rules of the committee, to stop violating the safety of the members of the committee, to stop holding themselves out as not caring by refusing to wear their masks.
Is it permissible to drink a sip of coffee?
It is not permissible.
Not to drink.
We can't drink coffee in the room.
Now. I'm getting ready to ask questions.
Mr.
And I will.
Mr. Gates is recognized.
No. He went.
He went, and that's why I took off my mask, Mr. Chairman.
It's my turn. I'm going to go.
Okay.
Mr. Jordan is recognized.
Mr. Attorney General, let's clear up a few things. Judge Berman Jackson agreed with your Stone sentencing recommendation. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, and she said, I am concerned 7 to 9 years would be greater than necessary. I agree with the defense and with the government's second memorandum. So it couldn't be more clear they agreed with you.
That's right.
Lafayette Square, would St. John's Church be standing today if you had not taken action?
Well, I think that was on Sunday night, and I think law enforcement did use tear gas. And my understanding is that night to clear the way so that the fire trucks could get in to save St. John's Church.
The church is.
That was on Sunday night, though.
Understand the time frame, but would it be standing today if there had not been action taken by federal law enforcement and local law enforcement?
Right.
38 people unmasked Michael Flynn's name 49 times in a 2-month time frame. 7 people at the Treasury Department unmasked Michael Flynn's name. Is this an issue that Mr. Durham is looking into?
I've asked another U.S. attorney to look into the issue of unmasking because of the high number of unmaskings and some that do not readily appear to have been in the line of normal business.
Wait a minute, so I want to be clear. So there is another investigation on that issue specifically going on at the Justice Department right now?
Yes.
Wow, that's great. So Mr. Durham is looking at how the whole Trump-Russia thing started. You have another U.S. attorney. Can you give us that U.S. attorney's name, or is that something you're comfortable doing? Or?
John Bash of Texas.
John Bash of Texas is looking specifically at the fact
At unmasking.
38 people, 49 times unmasked Michael Flynn's name, and probably other unmaskings that took place in the final days of the Obama-Biden administration. Is that accurate?
Actually, a much longer period of time.
Even before that?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. I appreciate that. That's information that the committee did not know. Are peaceful protests violent, Mr. Attorney General?
No.
Do peaceful protests destroy businesses?
No.
Do peaceful protests injure officers?
No.
Do peaceful protests attack civilians?
No.
Do peaceful protests burn down buildings?
No.
The video we played, it's hard to watch. It's really hard to watch to see that happening in our great country. But there was the start of it was almost laughable, where you have the reporter saying, as a building is burning behind him, it's not generally speaking an unruly protest. It's mostly just a protest. I mean, it's almost laughable when you have the reporter saying, I guess he's saying it's not a fire, it's just a burning building. I guess he's saying it's a peaceful burning building. A few weeks ago, well, let me ask you this. I want to go right to this. Is defunding the police a rational policy?
No, I think, if anything, I'm more concerned that the police be adequately funded today and get more resources. A lot of the things we need to do to address some of the concerns people have about what they saw in Minneapolis are going to take some resources, some of the training that we have to do. And one of the difficulties in our country, it's not a difficulty, it's a fact, we have 18,000 law enforcement agencies. Most of them are very, very small. And so we have to find a way of training, making sure the training is pushed out.
Is it dangerous? Dangerous to defund the police?
It's extremely dangerous.
Extremely dangerous. And some of the ordinances you're seeing cities pass are also dangerous. Are you familiar with the letter that Chief of Police of Seattle, Carmen Best, sent to business owners and residents in that city?
Yes, I am, saying that, she cannot protect, she can't do her job. Her police force cannot do the job because of
exactly what she said. Yeah. Gives officers, the policy they're trying to pass, thank goodness the court stopped it, the policy they're trying to pass gives officers no ability, and she emphasized no, not us, not you, Mr. Attorney, not me, gives officers no ability to safely intercede to preserve property in the midst of large, violent crowds. Mm-hmm. She also said in that letter, again, she's taken the leadership and responsibility to tell the business owners, the citizens, that she's supposed to serve. She also tells them in that letter, I've done my due diligence on informing the council numerous times. So she's saying, I tried to tell them, these people won't listen to me. And then finally she says this, and this is the scary part. This is why it's so dangerous. She says this in her letter, Seattle police will have an adjusted deployment. That's a nice way of saying, you're on your own. We can't help you. That is how scary this defund the police. And here's the kicker. These same cities sent you a letter last week. The same week Chief of Police Best does this to the residents and citizens of her city. Her mayor sends you a letter blaming the federal government for the violence that is happening in these cities. That is how ridiculous the left's position has become. I appreciate the work you're doing, Mr. Attorney General. I'm over time. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields. Mr. Jeffries.
Mr. Barr, the job of the Attorney General is to defend the best interests of the people and serve as the people's lawyer. But during your time as Attorney General, you have consistently undermined democracy, undermined the Constitution, and undermined the health, safety, and well-being of the American people, all to personally benefit Donald Trump. Now, you just testified that there's no mechanism for a president to contest an election that has clearly been won by the opponent. Mr. Attorney General, what will you do if Donald Trump loses the election on November 3rd, but refuses to leave office on January 20th?
If the results are clear, I would leave office.
Do you believe that there is any basis or legitimacy to Donald Trump's recent claim that he can't provide an answer as to whether he would leave office?
I really am not familiar with these comments or the context in which they occurred, so I'm not going to give commentary on them.
Okay, thank you. He just stated that publicly about a week ago to Fox News. Mr. Barr, during a radio interview this spring with Hugh Hewitt, you praised President Trump's coronavirus response as superb, correct?
Who did?
You did.
Okay.
Over 150,000 Americans have died. More than 4 million Americans have been infected. More than 5 million Americans have lost their health care. Over 100,000 small businesses have permanently closed. More than 50 million Americans are out of work. This is not the outcome of superb leadership. What we've gotten from Donald Trump is exactly the opposite.
Well,
Let's explore.
Well, I disagree with that.
That was not a question, that was a statement. Let's explore. In February, President Trump falsely claimed that the number of coronavirus cases would go from 15 to 0 in a few days. Was that superb? Yes or no?
I'd have to see the context in which it was said.
Here's the context. The number of cases didn't go down to 0. It's over 4 million. Let's go to March. In that month, President Trump said, "I take no responsibility at all for the failure in testing." Was that superb? Yes or no?
It was accurate. The problem with the testing system was a function of President Obama's mishandling of the CDC and his efforts to centralize everything in the CDC when they didn't have the
Thank you, Mr. Barr. That is inaccurate. That's a myth.
It wasn't until this administration. It wasn't until
claiming my time. In April, President Trump irresponsibly suggested that the American people inject themselves with bleach. Was that superb? Yes or no?
That's not what I heard.
That's exactly what he said. That's what the American people heard, and you know it, and you can't defend it. Let's move on to May. In that month, on National Nurses Day, President Trump falsely called PPE shortages fake news, while nurses and other healthcare professionals resorted to wearing trash bags and ski goggles to protect themselves. Fake news. Was that superb? Yes or no?
I think the administration did a good job of mustering PPE, and the national supply of PPE was run down during the Obama administration and never replaced.
Thank you, Mr. Barr. The answer is no, it was not superb. By June, President Trump irresponsibly continued to refuse to wear a mask despite the public health guidance from his own experts. Was that superb? Yes or no?
Which guidance? The earlier guidance that the masks wouldn't work?
You know exactly the guidance that we're talking about. The CDC and Dr. Fauci in April recommended that the American people wear a mask, but Donald Trump has become the poster boy for the anti-mask movement.
Donald Trump has probably tested more than any other human being on the face of
the
earth.
Mr. Barr, the answer is the refusal to wear a mask is not superb. Last question. In July, President Trump falsely claimed that 99% of COVID-19 cases are, quote, totally harmless. Was that superb? Yes or no?
I think essentially what he was saying is that the fatality rate relatively is very low, very low.
The answer is 150,000 Americans are dead. It has been a failure of epic proportions. In fact, Donald Trump's response to the coronavirus pandemic has been the worst failure of any president in American history. And the American people have paid the price. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition?
Well, I guess I do. I think it's my turn to speak and ask questions. Is that correct, Mr. Chairman? Then I seek recognition, sir.
Gentleman is recognized.
Bless your heart. Thank you. Attorney General Barr, Chairman Nadler opened up his statement by saying you can no longer hide behind a legal fiction. That caused me some consternation. I had no idea what he was talking about. Do you have any idea what he's talking about?
I don't recall that phrase in what context.
Well, who knows what context? I mean, he was just kind of rattling on there. But he he was attacking you and your performance and virtually everything he could, and said, you can no longer hide behind a legal fiction. And I didn't see any connection with anything else he had been saying, so I wondered if you had seen anything, and apparently you didn't see anything either. The next person to ask questions was the gentlelady from California, who consistently referred to civilian federal agents as federal troops, and intimating, if you will, that Portland was peaceable until federal civilian agents arrived on the scene. Essentially, it's kind of analogous to blaming a fire department for showing up to put out a fire and then being blamed for starting the fire. Attorney General Barr, let's just have it on the record. Was there violence and attempts to burn down, vandalize the building, and attack civilian employees of the federal government prior to any other federal agents or the reinforcements being sent in of federal agents?
Yeah, my recollection is our main effort to reinforce was around the 4th of July period, and it had been going on for quite a while before that.
Let's talk about Lafayette Square for a second. Leading up to June 1st, you had violent mobs disobeying the 11 p.m. curfew. They set fire to parked cars, demolished coffee shops and banks, burned American flags, and even intentionally set fire to St. John's Episcopal Church near Lafayette Square. Secret Service and Park Police appropriate use of safe restorative force actually cleared that up. In total, however, 51 U.S. Park Police officers were injured during the weekend leading up to the perimeter expansion. Do you want to expand on the actions regarding Lafayette Park?
Right, so for the 29th, 30th, and 31st, there was unprecedented rioting right around the White House, very violent. During that time, as you say, about 50 Park Police and a comparable number, is my recollection, of Secret Service. So we had about around 90 officers injured. I'm talking about things like concussions, one was operated on, and so forth. We had the president, it was so bad that, as it's been reported, the Secret Service recommended the president go down to the shelter. We had a breach of the Treasury Department. The historical building on Lafayette Park was burned down, the lodge. St. John's was set on fire. Bricks were thrown at the police repeatedly. They took crowbars and pried up the pavers on Lafayette Park and threw those at the police. Balloons of caustic liquid were thrown on the police. And it was clear when I arrived at the White House on Monday, there was total consensus that we couldn't allow that to happen so close to the White House, that kind of rioting. And therefore, we had to move the perimeter out one block and push it up toward I Street. And there was already a plan in being at that point that the Park Police and the Secret Service had worked out the night before, which was to put the perimeter further away and then give them time to put a non-scalable fence across the northern part of the park. During Monday, the factors that led to the timing of it were that movement was going to be made as soon as there were enough units in place to actually perform it, and units were very slow in getting into place throughout the day, much to my frustration because I wanted it moved before there was a big buildup of demonstrators. And also the fencing had to be delivered. And when those things were accomplished, the tactical commander in charge of the Park Police proceeded with the movement of pushing the perimeter. So this was something conceived of long before and didn't turn on the nature of the crowd, although I would say the crowd was very unruly. And while the tactical considerations were made by the Park Police, they tried to respond to the situation. To say that this had to do with a photo op is, and I don't mean to analogize this to a military operation, but it's akin to saying that we invaded the Philippines in World War II so Douglas MacArthur could walk through the surf on the beach. One follows the other, but we did not invade the Philippines so that Douglas MacArthur could walk to the beach.
Thank you. Yield.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Swalwell.
Mr. Barr, have you ever intervened other than to help the president's friend get a reduced prison sentence for any other case where a prosecutor had filed a sentencing recommendation with the court?
A sentencing recommendation?
Yeah, have you ever intervened, other than that case with the president's friend?
Not that I recall, if you're talking.
Does that seem like something you'd recall, where you would?
Well, I'm saying I can't really remember my first, if you let me finish the question. I
That's
can't
a big
remember.
deal.
30 years ago, I was Attorney General.
As Attorney General now?
No, I didn't, but that's because issues come up to the Attorney General within a dispute, and I have never heard of a dispute. I've never heard of a dispute in the department where
Barr.
line prosecutors threaten to quit
Well, it's a pretty
because,
big deal,
because,
and they
because of a,
So,
Mr.
Mr. Barr,
discussion over sentencing.
Americans
akin
from
to
both
this.
parties are concerned that in Donald Trump's America, there's two systems of justice. One for Mr. Trump and his cronies, and another for the rest of us. But that can only happen if you enable it. At your confirmation hearing, you were asked, do you believe a president could lawfully issue a pardon in exchange for the recipient's promise to not incriminate him? You said, no.
Not to what?
That would be a crime. You were asked, could a president issue a pardon in exchange for the recipient's promise to not incriminate him? And you responded, no, that would be a crime. Is that right?
Yes, I said that.
You said a crime. You didn't say it'd be wrong. You didn't say it'd be unlawful. You said it would be a crime. And when you said that a president swapping a pardon to silence a witness would be a crime, you were promising the American people that if you saw that, you would do something about it. Is that right?
That's right.
Now, Mr. Barr, are you investigating Donald Trump for commuting the prison sentence of his longtime friend and political advisor, Roger Stone?
No.
Why not?
Why should I?
Well, let's talk about that. Mr. Stone was convicted by a jury on 7 counts of lying in the Russia investigation. He bragged that he lied to save Trump's butt. But why would he lie? Your prosecutors, Mr. Barr, told a jury that Stone lied because the truth looked bad for Donald Trump. And what truth is that? Well, Donald Trump denied in written answers to the Russia investigators that he talked to Roger Stone during the time Roger Stone was in contact with agents of a Russian influence operation. There's evidence that Trump and Stone indeed did talk during that time. You would agree that it's a federal crime to lie under oath. Is that right?
Yes.
It's a crime for you, it's a crime for me, and it's certainly a crime for the President of the United States. Is that right?
Yes.
So if Donald Trump lied to the Mueller investigators, which you agree would be a crime, then Roger Stone was in a position to expose Donald Trump's lies. Are you familiar with the December 3rd, 2018 tweet where Donald Trump said Roger Stone had shown guts by not testifying against him?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
You don't read the president's tweets?
No.
Well, there's a lot of evidence in the president's tweets, Mr. Attorney General. I think you should start reading them because he said Mr. Stone showed guts, but on July 10 of this year, Roger Stone declared to a reporter, I had 29 or 30 conversations with Trump during the campaign period. Trump knows I was under enormous pressure to turn on him. It would have eased my situation considerably, but I didn't. The prosecutors wanted me to play Judas. I refused. Are you familiar with that Stone statement?
Actually, I'm not.
So how can you sit here and tell us, why should I investigate the President of the United States if you're not even aware of the facts concerning the President using the pardon or commutation power to swap the silence of a witness?
Because we require, a reliable predicate before we open a criminal investigation.
And I just gave to you, sir.
I don't consider it. I consider it a very Rube Goldberg theory that you have.
Well, it sounds like you're hearing this.
And by the way, if I applied this standard, there'd be a
General,
lot more people under investigation.
Mr. Attorney General, the very same day that Roger Stone said that, Donald Trump,
that's one of the
no surprise,
the true two standards of justice were really during the tail end of the Obama administration.
Mr. Attorney General, let's turn to the Michael Cohen case. Are you aware, sir, that Michael Cohen, after being released from prison, was asked to not engage with the media, including to write a book? Were you aware that that was going to be asked of him?
Was I aware?
Yes.
No.
Do you know if anyone else in your department was aware?
Maybe I should tell you what happened.
Why don't you tell us what happened?
Okay. He was furloughed from the Bureau of Prisons.
No. Why don't you tell us why he was asked to
I will
sign
tell
an
you.
agreement not
Because something that people don't seem to understand is that his home confinement was not being supervised by the Bureau of Prisons. It was being supervised by the probation office, which is part of the U.S. court system. And it was the U.S. court system that had the requirements about not writing.
That U.S. court system called your actions retaliatory. Do you agree with that?
No, so all I know is what has been said in court before the judge and in the record, which is that the individual was then called by the U.S. court system saying that this guy Cohen is uncooperative, he's not agreeing to the conditions. And at that point, a Bureau of Prisons person made the decision that he was no longer eligible for home confinement.
Conditions that a federal judge said no other inmate had ever been asked of in his experience. Mr. Barr, you told ABC News that the president's tweets sometimes make your job impossible. But sir, your job is only impossible if you enable the president's corrupt schemes. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Attorney General, the Constitution says the President shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. Do you note any other limitations in the Constitution on the President's power to pardon?
No.
Has the President exceeded that power?
No.
My colleague from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, implied that in challenging the sentencing recommendation of Roger Stone, you were doing the bidding of the President. He didn't want to hear your response. I would.
Well, no, I was, Roger Stone, I never discussed our sentencing recommendation with anyone outside the Department of Justice. It was a very condensed period of time. I first heard, I made the decision that we shouldn't take a position as to the precise sentence, but should leave it up to the judge. And we should not affirmatively advocate for 7 to 9 years. And I made that on Monday the 10th. And that night we filed, the department filed, and it didn't reflect what I had decided. So that night I told people we had to fix it first thing in the morning. So we did. As soon as I got in, we went forward with a plan to file. At that point, I learned about the president's tweet because I don't monitor the president's tweets, and I hesitated because I knew that I would be attacked for doing it, and people would make argue that I did it because of the tweet. But I felt at the end of the day, I really had to go forward with our filing because it was the right thing to do, and I'm glad the judge agreed with it.
We're learning more and more about the targeting and prosecution and extortion of Michael Flynn by partisan officials at the FBI. No one has been held accountable for this grotesque abuse of power. Knowing that agents with a political agenda can take anything that someone says, edit it, misrepresent it, prosecute it, and then extort confessions by threatening family members, and to do so with impunity, why would anyone in his right mind ever want to talk to an FBI agent again?
Well, I don't, I haven't reached judgments, and I'm not suggesting that all those facts you set forth are true, and we have not, at this point, challenged the actions of I've defended the actions of the prosecutors in this case in court. The order of business right now is, knowing what we know now, we don't think any of the U.S. attorneys in the department would have prosecuted this case, partly because of the behavior of the FBI, but also because the evidence is not there to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And part of what I'm trying to establish is that we will use the same standards for everybody before we indict anybody. And this goes for both sides. We won't prosecute anybody unless there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt that they committed a crime. And not some kind of esoteric made-up crime, but a meat and potatoes crime.
For more than 3 years, the most powerful agencies in our government took information that was fabricated by agents of a political campaign that they knew was fraudulent, used it as justification to launch an investigation alleging treason against a presidential candidate, then leaked the existence of that investigation in a manner that was clearly calculated to affect the outcome of the election, and then failing that, used it in a largely successful attempt to obstruct the duly elected president. Are you going to be able to right this wrong before it becomes a precedent for future election interference by corrupt officials in our justice and intelligence agencies?
I really can't predict that. I think, as you know, John Durham is looking at all these matters. COVID did delay that action for a while, but he's working very diligently. And, justice is not something you order up on a schedule like you're ordering a pizza.
Well, there are many of us who are concerned that if you were succeeded by someone like Keith Ellison as Attorney General, that this will become an institutionalized practice and the investigation of Mr. Durham will simply go away.
I understand your concern.
One more thing, a term we keep hearing from the left is, these are mostly peaceful protests, mostly peaceful. It seems to me that you either are or you're not. Calling what's happening in our cities mostly peaceful protests is a lot like calling Scott Peterson a mostly faithful husband or Al Capone a mostly law-abiding businessman. There is a constitutional right to peaceably assemble. Where does that right stop?
When it becomes violence, criminal activity. You know, and that's the challenge here. I mean, you have a lot of people who are out protesting and demonstrating, and that's important First Amendment activity that we believe strongly in and try to protect. The particular violent opportunists that are involved here get into those crowds and then start engaging in very violent activity and hijack it. And a lot of protesters have been telling law enforcement and providing information to us about these people who are not with them, they're not demonstrators, but they're coming in. And a lot of demonstrators leave when that happens because they see what's happening themselves.
Would you call that violence a myth?
Gentleman's time?
No.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Liu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Barr, for being here today. I'd like to ask you some questions about the legal standard for seizing and arresting protesters. Under the Fourth Amendment, it requires probable cause before you can seize and arrest a protester, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, and the probable cause has to be particularized to a particular person. So if a protester was merely standing around in a crowd in the vicinity of someone else suspected of criminal activity, you cannot arrest that peaceful protester. In other words, there's no such thing as probable cause by mere association, correct?
Well, not strictly, but I'll say that, you know, you do need particularized probable cause.
Okay, and if there's no probable cause,
if someone jumps into a getaway car and there are 3 or 4 people in there, that might be enough to give you probable cause, just those circumstances. You don't need it on each individual.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Attorney General. If there's no probable cause, you can't arrest a protester, correct?
I said at the beginning, arrest has to be predicated on probable cause.
All right. Now, an arrest can also occur whether or not the federal official says it's an arrest. So, for example, if a federal officer takes a protester into custody, transport that protester, let's say, to a federal building, detains a person for questioning, that will constitute an arrest whether or not the federal official says the person's under arrest, correct?
Well, that would require a very intensive review of all the specifics involved.
Actually, it wouldn't. In the case of Dunaway versus New York, which is black letter law for over 40 years, the question was whether the police violated the 4th and 15th Amendments when, without probable cause to arrest, they took petitioners into custody, transported him to a police station, and detained him for questioning. The answer is yes, that would constitute an arrest.
No, the answer is that, you know, Fourth Amendment is ultimately governed by reasonableness, and there can be circumstances. The question sometimes is, when does something actually become custody?
Reclaiming my time, this is not a trick question, Mr. Barr. I'm just citing you what the Supreme Court said. So here's a problem. Under the standard black letter law, which has been in effect for over 40 years, what the federal forces in Portland did was unconstitutional. Federal forces in full combat gear, in the dark of night, grabbed a protester who was peacefully standing there, forced him into an unmarked van, drove him to a separate location, searched him, detained him, and questioned him. That is what police states do. That's what authoritarian regimes do.
But I don't think those were the facts.
That's not, I haven't asked you a question yet, Mr. Barr.
Okay.
What the federal officials did was illegal because they didn't have probable cause. And how do we know that? Because Deputy Director of the Federal Protective Service, Chris Klein, admitted it on national TV. Deputy Director Klein said that the individual that they were questioning was in a crowd and in an area where another individual was aiming a laser at the eyes of officers. That's guilt by association. That's what the Fourth Amendment prohibits. Deputy Director Klein further stated that the protester was released after federal officials concluded, quote, they did not have what they needed, unquote, which again shows there's no probable cause. And it appears that federal Deputy Director Klein appears to understand that there was no probable cause because he essentially justifies that action as saying it wasn't an arrest. He calls it, quote, a simple engagement, unquote. I'm a former prosecutor. I've never heard that term, a simple engagement, because it's a made-up excuse. What these federal officials did was an arrest. They grabbed a peaceful protester, they forced him into a van, drove him to another location, questioned him. That is exactly what the Supreme Court prohibited over 40 years ago.
So
and that's
not an
isolated incident.
I obviously don't know that.
Washington Post, I haven't asked you a question yet. In a Washington Post article on July 24th entitled Operation Diligent Valor, federal agents told reporters that there's no basis for these arrests. They said, quote, at times they have grabbed an individual and taken them inside the courthouse for questioning before determining that they had no probable cause to charge him with any crime, unquote. Deputy Director Klein said that they coordinate with the U.S. Attorney's Office on all of these arrests. I urge you to instruct your federal officials to comply with the Constitution, and I ask you to investigate these arrests because many of them are in violation of the Fourth Amendment. We do not live in a police state. We're better than that. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since Representative Liu didn't allow you any time to answer his allegations, would you care to answer any of his allegations?
Yes, I mean, obviously, I don't know all the particulars of any individual case out there, but based on my general understanding, what had happened was that when they tried to effectuate arrests of the ringleaders or the people who were engaged in violence or that they saw with lasers and so forth, and they went out, they were immediately swarmed by people in black, and there was a lot of violence, so they couldn't effectuate the arrest. So the modus operandi was changed, and based on specific information as to individuals who were seen doing things and identified, they later tried to pick them up when there was less of a risk of this kind of mob response. The fact that if you have information that someone has a laser and is using it and later pick him up and he doesn't have it, it doesn't mean that there wasn't probable cause. It means he doesn't have the laser. The question is, was it reasonable for you to rely on the information that you had and the identification of that individual? In some cases, it could be a misidentification. In other cases, it could be the person, ditched the laser. So there is a distinction between whether the person ultimately can be shown to have violated the law and whether there was probable cause for the police to make the inquiry and take them and interrogate them or ask them questions at least.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. I think I have to tell you, you probably know this, my constituents are scared. Americans are scared. I mean, they watch the TV, they see all this rioting, looting going on, statues being torn down. In Arizona, where I'm from, more guns are being sold than ever. I think there's more new gun owners than ever. And this has to stop. And I think that it's really important, as the saying goes, that in order to solve a problem, the first step is to realize there's a problem. And so I find it very disturbing, should I say, that Chairman Nadler denies that Antifa even exists. He said it to a reporter. He said on the floor of the United States House of Representatives that it was a fantasy, a made-up fantasy. And then in this very room, just recently, Congresswoman Jayapal, who represents the Seattle area, said, when I was talking about the autonomous zone and the takeover, she said, the area is just a few miles from where I sit right now, and there is no takeover. There is no takeover. She also said, lies are being spread by my colleagues in this committee. This area is perfectly peaceful. She also said, my Republican colleagues keep saying the Seattle Police Precinct was taken over by protesters. This is incorrect. Incorrect. No one has taken over that building. Mr. Attorney General, is that your understanding of what happened there? Do you agree with Ms. Jayapal that there was no takeover? It was just
Jayapal.
peaceful?
If you're going to say my name, please say it right. It's Jayapal.
Jayapal, would you agree with that? And also, in answer why do you think these autonomous zones in Democrat-led cities are dangerous to America?
Well, starting with they're dangerous because they are purporting to keep on the outside duly constituted authority of the government. They're also, to me, outrageous because the people who are living now under this autonomous zone haven't selected the government. They've selected the duly authorized government of the city and the state. So it's quite an outrage that people would use force to take over an area. What makes me concerned for the country is this is the first time in my memory that the leaders of one of our great two political parties, the Democratic Party, are not coming out and condemning mob violence and the attack on federal courts. Why can't we just say, the violence against federal courts has to stop? Could we hear something like that?
Mr. Attorney General, I totally agree. I support what you're doing, and I support what President Trump is doing for law and order in our country, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The committee will stand in recess for 5 minutes.